Hello, my name's Rob and welcome to Swift Slots, and welcome back to part 2 of my 1/24th scale light restoration video for my two 1/24th scale cars. So in part 1 I did my little yellow Corvette, got her all running and looking very pretty, and in this part 2 I'm going to be turning my attentions to my Scale Auto Viper. So let's talk, let's get to the bench, and let's get this beauty back where she belongs on the track, looking awesome. Okay, so for the benefit of those kind souls out there that worry for my health and wondering why I'm going to be wearing a plaster, it's because I smacked the end of my thumb into a shelf when I was putting something back in a hurry whilst getting out the Christmas orders, and I stubbed the end of my thumb straight into the end of the shelf and I bent back my nail, and it really hurts. So this is why I'm going to be wearing a plaster for the next video or so. So I haven't lacerated myself with a scalpel. I've simply stubbed my nail, and I don't want my nail to be rucked up all the time and catching on everything because it hurts. So there we are, that's why I've got that. Right, let's move on to this body now. So I think what we'll start with doing is just giving this body a little bit of a polish up with some of my Meguiar's Ultimate Compound. It's a cutting compound with a little bit of polish in it as well, but we don't really need to worry too much about the polish. So we'll just go with the cutting compound, and what we get is what we'll get. That'll be absolutely fine. So let's give them a quick little dust off, because we don't want to be polishing in the dust ideally. And that's it. So we'll give them a quick polish up now, and then we'll move on and we'll put the spoiler in. Okay, that's a lot better. We took a couple of casualties when I was polishing off this body, that being the little round thing on the roof and the windscreen wiper. So we'll just pop those back now, and then we can move on to getting the rear spoiler on. Okay, so with those little pieces put back on, I think what I'm going to do now is I'm going to position this rear spoiler exactly where I want it to be, and then I'll bring the glue to the job via my scalpel, because this rear spoiler does actually move ever so slightly. So if I make sure that that spoiler is exactly where I want it relative to the body, and it's not pointing down or up or whatever, I can really feel for where that is going to be. And it's right there, I can feel it, it's located in. So then what I can do is get my glue and bring it to the job on the end of my scalpel just here. So a nice reasonable bit of glue on there, and come on the inside. Actually, it's a bit uncomfortable, there's a bit too much there, so take a little bit off, then come to the inside of the job, and then just position the glue right where I want it off of my scalpel on the inside of the spoiler, and then you don't see, let that soak in, and then do exactly the same for the other side. So I always find that this gives me the most amount of control. Now, I have got my pink zap glue, which is absolutely lethal, but I've chucked it away because it decided it wasn't gluing anything. I think it might have gone off, so I just use this ordinary thick stuff for now. So there we are, so that will be absolutely fine. That will now glue in, and that will just seep into the joint nice and quietly. And then what we'll do is we finish with the body now, so we'll put him to one side and we'll focus on this chassis. Now, I've had a little bit of a poke around with this chassis, and I've discovered that the axles that I actually bought to do the job are exactly the same size as what's on the car. So there's absolutely no advantage in using these axles at all, sadly. However, I have found that these axles are 5mm shorter front and rear than what I would like. However, I can actually sink the axles 5mm or 2mm or 2.5mm per side inside the wheel, and you've still got absolutely plenty of boss back there to go on, plus the little bit of overshoot on the other side of the wheel as well. So the back tyres, although they're a little bit further out of the axle that I would like, they're absolutely fine. And the same as for the front axle as well. It's not quite so generous on the front as we've got on the back. They're a little bit further out than I would like on the front, really, but they'll be absolutely fine, mainly because there's not as much boss pointing on the other side of the wheel, the front face of the wheel. If I show you here, you'll see what I mean. So the rear of the wheel has got all that boss there, plus the thickness of the wheel. And on this other side here, we've only got probably about 3 millimeters of actual, I'll measure it for you now. Perhaps I can measure it. Yes, I can. There we are. 2.5 mil. So really, all I've got, my axle has to be flush with this front face of the wheel because I need 5 millimeters overall. So I'm negating all of this boss on here, but I've still got all this boss here, which is probably enough, plus the thickness of the wheel, which isn't very much, but it's, again, probably enough. So ideally, I would like 5 millimeter longer axles front and rear. Now, I do actually have my own stock of ground silver steel, but it's not as hard as this steel, which is not really a huge problem, I guess, until you do up your grub screw. And what will happen is it'll bite into the axle, it'll swell the axle in on that contact point, and then you won't be able to get the wheel off afterwards. So what you would normally do then is you grind a little flat, so you dent the flat and you can still remove. However, then you're reducing the surface contact where that grub screw is. I guess you are anyway, because the grub screw will be pushing in from that direction and your flat will be on the top. But I still don't like removing axle. The more axle you can have in your wheel or your gear, the better. And also, because I'm 2.5 mil short, I don't have all this contact over here as well. So by putting a flat on the axle, it's really reducing your surface contact. I don't want to do it. So I'm going to use these standard axles here. But if anybody knows of any proper slot car axles of genuine hardened steel in 3 millimeters that's 75 millimeters long, let me know, because I'd love to replace these axles with genuinely full length axles so I can go right to the end of that wheel. So with that said, I've also had a play around with these inserts. Now I've discovered that these inserts actually have a front and a rear insert. There is genuinely a front and rear insert, and you can see by the length of those backs. So these short ones go on the front and these longer ones go on the rear, because that's how the wheels are set up. I've also found that the inserts are about 7 or 14 thou too big to go in the wheel. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but trust me, it's enough to stop the insert from going into the wheel. So I've done a 7 thou cut on this front wheel, on this front insert, and now it clears beautifully. It's not slack, but it's not loose, it's fine. But also I've discovered that this little tube on the back, in my opinion, is a little bit tight to squeeze over that boss. So what I've also done is I've just got an ordinary twist drill, 4 millimeters, and I've just gone in there by hand and just opened up that little tube. Doesn't take much off, it more swells it than cuts it. And then that has given me the absolute perfect fit to go in the wheel. As you heard, it nice little pop in there, and that's absolutely perfect. And the back one, I found I had to have a 4.2 mil drill again inside that hole there, just by hand, just to open up that. And now that back wheel is an absolute perfect fit in there as well, and you give a nice little rebate all around the wheel there, so it's a little bit more inserted than the front wheel, which is exactly how I like it. So that's done with regards these inserts. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a pair of spacers to go on the front end here to get my spacing and my wheel correct. I'll make 2 little brass spacers to replace these plastic ones. I'll also clean up these wheels and put the brake discs. No, that's not what I'm going to do. I'm going to clean all these wheels up, in fact, and then I'm going to paint them, because I've actually decided that I'm going to paint these wheels like somewhere between a dark gunmetal grey and silver. So it'll be silver with a little bit of black in it. So because I have decided to turn these wheels a little bit darker. So that's what I'm going to do now. Actually, I'm going to take off all these wheels. I'm going to clean them all up, take all the tyres off them, and then spray these inserts and these wheels with a little bit of sort of gunmetal grey and make some inserts, and then I can move on to the next stage. actually, just before we go too much further into getting these wheels all painted up, I think what I'm going to actually do is make these back wheels wider, as I suggested earlier on in part 1, but I'm going to do it now, just before I get the paint on, because there's a chance that I could chip the paint as I mess around making these wider. So without going into extreme boring detail, I've already tested these wheels on this chassis, my clearances and everything else, and I can actually get an extra 6mm of depth on this wheel, so that I can actually use my PU tyres and make these wheels a bit deeper to use my PU tyres. I will have to trim a little bit off the back, because I say these came from the Corvette and they're full size for the Corvette. They're just a little bit wide for this car, but I can still get 6mm of extra wheel on this wheel. So what we'll do now is we'll nip over to the lathe and I'll make an insert that goes into the back of this wheel, utilizing this little rebate here. I'll have to reinstate that hole so that I can still get to the grub screw, but it'll be a little tube rebated to slide into the back of that wheel, a nice push fit with a little bit of epoxy, and that will give me an extra 6mm of wheel. Then I can slip these PU tyres on once I've painted the wheel, and then pop them in the lathe and then trim the tyre up to exactly the right length to accept the new wheel depth. So before we go too much further, let's grab this piece of aluminium bar and we'll make the wheel extensions to go on the back of these wheels. Okay, as you can see from this pile of parts, I was just about to go to a fast forward building up of these wheels montage. However, I spotted a problem. These front wheels have got ribs. Now, there wouldn't normally be a problem because I could just machine them off, apart from the fact that they're heavily rebated in there, and I think that rebate goes in there really, really deep. So I'm going to have a problem trying to get my tyres that I've made on, because my tyres were made for flat wheels. And I don't really want to have to make a brand new tyre master just with a rib in it. So I thought, well, how on earth am I going to circumnavigate this? And then I came up with a solution. So I'll show you what the solution is. Here is the bar that I had left over from making the wheel extensions for the rear wheels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this tyre inside out and then flip it onto this rather large aluminium bar, get it all nicely lined up, and then I shall show you how I'm going to circumnavigate this problem of not having a rib in this tyre. So once you've turned the tyre inside out and attacked it with a Dremel on a lathe, you end up with a groove. So what you just got to do now is peel this tyre back off this alloy wheel, which turns it back the right way by default. Then we'll be able to put our front wheel into the tyre, and lo and behold, we actually have a tyre that actually fits the rim exactly as it should have done if it had a rib to start with. Haha, right, on we go assembling these wheels. Okay, so I've got to the point now where I've got all my parts for the chassis all made up, and I'm ready to put all the wheels and axles back onto the chassis. So as you can see, I've already gone ahead and I've worked out my spacings, and I've made myself 2 axle spacers for the front axle, and I've also made 2 spacers for the rear. It's 2 different sizes because one has got the gear and one has got the axle stopper. These aren't strictly necessary, at least on the back, because I've got these effectively axle stoppers on the gear and a proper axle stopper, but it's just easier for quick assembly. And I've gone ahead of this video and I've worked out all my widths and got everything exactly where I want it, and everything's nice and symmetrical, so I know exactly how big these spacer tubes are supposed to be. It's very boring work, you don't want to see it, so I've just gone ahead and done it. Also, I've made this little packer piece here to go between these 2 nuts. So that piece there goes across to hold those wires down so the axle can go underneath it and the wires don't get in the way of the axle. Another little just thing I've done off camera. So also what I've got to do now before I can reassemble it is just get these rear bearings out and swap them over for a fresh set, like I said at the beginning, because I think these bearings are a little bit worn and they could do with a little bit of a refresh. So we just pop those out and I can put in the new Scale Auto bearings from the packet. And there we are, all nicely seated. So now it's just a case of popping in the axle and making sure that that's nice and square according to the axle stopper and the gear, and then we can get the wheels on. There we are. So now we've got nice and even axle spacings either side of that bulkhead, which means we're good to go. We can nip up these screws and then we could pop the wheels on, and that's the back end done. Now unfortunately, because I put these wheel spacers in, the only way to get access to these rear screws is either to have a cut down Allen key, which would be a bit of a fiddle, or to just go in through the middle of the tyre and go in straight like that. It's a little bit crude, I know, gets the job done. I'm not that worried about it, so nor should you be. So let's pop these wheels on. And And there we are, that's the back end done. I spent a little bit of time on that because I wanted to try and get these brake calipers at exactly the same position, so in the photograph it looks all nice and even. It's a little bit silly, I know, but that's just the way I roll. Okay, so that's the back end all done now. Now we just need to pop the front ends together. So just a simple case of getting the front axle all lined up, popping the spacers in, putting the wheels on, and we're good to go as well. This is a little bit easier on the front end because we haven't got so much overhang, but you know, it is what it is. So there we are. You can pretty much eyeball that. You can see how little axle I've actually got on this side now. It's still enough for the Boss, but it would be nice to have a little bit more. So like I said earlier on, if anybody knows of a 75mm long axle, that would be awesome. I would be very grateful with the link. But for now, these will work perfectly adequately, so we can pop those wheels on there. We don't want to pull them up too tight because you don't want to squash the bearings. So we just nip up one side first. I'll just clock where the brake disc is, or the caliper, stick him down there, and then we can turn the other one around, get him exactly the same, and then we can nip him up. Typical, it's on the other side of the wheel. There we go, over there. So just double check, 12 o'clock, 12 o'clock. And then we just nip up the wheel like that, check it's all nice and free, which it is. Job done. Right, so that's the front end done as well. Now we can just pop on my little spacer here just to keep those wires down like that. Pop the nuts on. And there we are, all finished. That's the chassis all put back together again. And in case you're wondering, I have already gone over all these screws to make sure the ones that I want to stay are nice and tight. And I have already adjusted these 4 screws here to get the wheelbase exactly where I want them for my body. So that's all been done already. So the last job to do now is to get this chassis mounted to the body. And like I said, this chassis didn't come with this body, so we need to put it on. But this body is designed for having a bolt-on chassis or something, I'm not entirely sure. So it's actually got these removable inner side skirts which make it incredibly easy to mount your chassis to. So all I need to do, so there is the actual mount there that's kind of completely removable. It has nothing to do with the body, you see, it just goes on these mounts. So all I actually need to do now is get this chassis exactly lined up in the wheels and everywhere else where I want it to be, mark out these 4 holes on the plastic, remove those plastics, drill the hole and screw it straight in. But just before I do all that, I have got a small problem in as much as this inner plate all moves about. Now I'm sure that's perfect for float when you're racing, but like again, same with the Corvette, I won't really be racing this car. I really want it to look nice and just be good for a domestic small track and just keep me happy. So what I'm going to do, each one of these bolts has actually got a little brass standoff in there. I'm going to take those little standoffs out and I'm going to bolt this middle plate down to this lower plate or the main chassis, actually bolt it down solid. That means then that when this chassis goes into the body and I have it exactly where I want it, when it's all screwed down, it will stay where I put it and you won't get that sort of longitudinal movement or the side movement. So these wheels are incredibly tight in the arches and I don't want them to move and start rubbing. So by taking out those little spaces and clamping that down nice and tight, although not great for racing, it's absolutely good enough for me. So I'll keep the nuts, I'll keep the little spacers handy somewhere, and so that I don't lose them. But that's what I'm going to do now. So I'm going to remove those little spacers and then clamp this down, and then I'm going to offer it into the body, mark it out, drill the holes, screw these little side plates in, and I can wiggle it around on these adjusters here and get the whole thing exactly where I want it, and then lock it down solid, and that's this build completely done. Oh, just before I get on with that, I guess you want to know, did those rear bearings stop all the rear play? And the answer is absolutely yes. There is no play in that back axle at all. As you can see, I'm wiggling around, there's nothing. So those old bearings were a little bit worn out, so it was time for a refresh. Okay, so that's the chassis all screwed into place, all looking pretty close. And as you saw, I took out these little spacers to stop this lower plate here from moving around. I don't love the way that the washers are now sitting at a slight angle, clamping this plate, but I did try and pop one of these washers on the other side, but it just looked even worse. So I've left them out, and the washers are just slightly sort of cant, just gripping the edge of this plate, and it's absolutely fine. So as you can see, we've got the fitment pretty damn good right off the bat. This side's about perfect. This side wants to come down a little tiny bit, and the front wheels are just very slightly over to this side on the chassis. So I just need to slacken off these two screws here, just tweak the front end over about 1 millimeter, and then we'll be absolutely perfect. So let's do those last little adjustments, and then we can hit the track. And there we are. After many months of sitting on my shelf doing absolutely nothing, my beautiful Scale Auto Dodge Viper is now fully fixed and a fully fledged slot car once again, just like my yellow Corvette. So now I can take these cars to the track and I can play with them to my heart's content whenever I feel like it, unlike being broken on a shelf, which isn't helping anybody. So if you were curious about these tyres that I was using in these two videos, there's a link below this video onto my website, and it'll take you directly to these tyres where they can be purchased. And if you're wondering why these cars are a little bit skatey on the track, it's not because the tyres won't grip, it's because that track is so tight and these cars are so large that I wanted to keep everything a little bit dusty just so that I could snake these cars around the track. Otherwise I do tend to get a bit bound up on the tyre wall if there's too much grip. So if you've enjoyed this sort of content, maybe you'll subscribe, and if you could hit the little bell button, that would be awesome. So, until the next time, thank you very much.